A really important skill set to have when working with file input and output is the ability to process strings in more and more intelligent ways. We're just going to start to touch on a few strategies in this chapter, or this unit, I suppose. And in the next unit, we're going to talk about a few more as we build our competence in this area. But here's a few new terms for us, or a couple new terms, to be able to think through what it is we're dealing with when especially retrieving data from a file, the input phase of the input-output. The first term is something called a delimiter, which is the characters that separate our strings into individual sections, and the tokens, which are the actual individual strings that are separated by delimiters. And to really understand what these things mean, I want you to think about a phrase, maybe, hello, friend. Oops. Hello, friend. I want to go to the store. How many sentences are in this phrase? Let's go back to elementary school for a minute and see how well you can do at recalling. Let's hope you answered 2, because there are 2 sentences here. Hello, friend is 1, and I want to go to the store is another. How do we know these are separate sentences? Well, in English, we have these things called punctuation, and these periods represent the end of one sentence, and then whatever comes next is another one. So these things delimit a sentence. Each dot is a delimiter, and each phrase outside of the dots is a token, or in this context, a sentence. Unless we specify, the delimiter for every type of input from a file is going to be an empty space. So that means that if we try to read in things in a string, we have an empty space as being a common delimiter, or also sometimes a new line. If we run something like A up here, read one line from file, this read line, the delimiter built in here is a new line, which looks like this. Okay, this new line command, that's kind of what's built into the read line. So it goes up until a new line appears and then it stops. Kind of like a sentence goes up to a period and then stops. And we have the ability to kind of customize the way that we recognize the end of a line when we're processing strings. So what I want us to see here is we are going to grab some data from our file. So let's find, where's my file here? Here. This one we created in the last lesson. Here's my first text. Here is more text to add to it. We call this testfile.txt. So we have a reader. Actually, let's create a new one. I think I deleted it. Reader equals reader. And my reader is going to read all data from file. And we're going to get it from, what did I call it? Testfile.txt. I'm going to store this in a variable called data. And at the end, I'm going to print out what's inside my data and see that I got the data. And here we go. Here's my first text. Here's more text to add to it. One question I have right now is, what type of information am I getting from this data file? Let's just find out. And it is a string. It's a single string, in fact. And it's interesting because this string is on 2 separate lines, which means that there's some other information that we're not seeing here. In fact, there's a new line here and a new line at the end here, which we can kind of see in this file. There's a third line created, which means there's a new line hidden character here and a new line 1 here that makes the new line appear down here. So that information is kind of just buried away, not shown in the console, but it is present in the string itself. Worth remembering. Okay, so what I want to be able to do is actually deal with these words individually. That's something that's going to be useful in this section, and in fact, a lot of the time in coding. So how do we do this in Python? How do we take this string with a bunch of words in it and break it down into their individual ones? Well, luckily, we have a really nice tool to do this. All words is going to equal my data, and this is a string, so it has all these string methods, but I'm going to use this method called split. And if I do this, and I print out my all words, and I run this, I see that it splits my string up into a list of every word individually. Wonderful. Now this split basic command is really, really wonderful in Python. It's quite intelligent, and it ignores all of the new lines. It just removes them entirely and assumes that we just want every single word individually placed in this array. So it took away the new lines, and in fact, it kept everything separated by a space. So the delimiter the thing that represented individual sections was the space, and the tokens are all the information around those spaces, which is all the individual words, although do notice the exclamation point stayed with text and with it. So if we wanted that removed, we have to do that separately to kind of prune off any other exclamations or any extra punctuation. Not super relevant right now, but it's something to be mindful of. So this works just fine if we're splitting information normally just around the basic delimiter of an empty space. So this is an empty space delimiter. But what if instead, I'm going to comment this out for now, we wanted to split this data, subword list equals my data split a different way. I can actually specify a delimiter string that I want to split this content around. I'm going to put in the exclamation point. And now if I print out my subwords list, I see that I have 3 entries in my list. 1, 2, and 3. The first entry is everything up until the first exclamation point. Here is my first text. That makes sense, because this exclamation point delimits the content. However, what happens next is, well, apparently a new line after that exclamation point, which is true. There is a new line there. And then here's more text to add to it up until that next exclamation point. That's the second token. And then after the exclamation point, there's technically one more piece of content, which is the new line. So this custom delimiter doesn't actually prune out the new lines very nicely. Now, there is something in coding called regular expressions that we could use to prune this a little bit more specifically, but it's beyond the scope of our course, so we're going to have to do something a little bit more custom to manage this. And since there might be some times in your processing in this section where you want to have a custom delimiter potentially up and running, it's not required, but it might be useful depending on what type of text you're examining. I need a special way of managing to kind of prune off these extra new line entries just to keep the text a little bit more pure. And I've actually provided you here. If you need to do this, you can look at this. I'm actually not going to provide you with this code in a file directly, but I'll leave it on the screen here, and you can copy it down if you need to. This is a method that could help clean up a list of data to remove the new line's content from it. What it does is it takes the data as a parameter, and it loops through all the information in the data, and I replace all of the new lines in that data with nothing. I basically just get rid of them. This data I reference is accessing whatever slot we're at in my list of data. So the first time through this, it accessed the first, well, phrase, which would be this one here. Here is my first text. And it would find, when it tried to replace the new line, that there was no new line to replace. So it wouldn't actually do anything on my first set of data. Next, I look at if my length of my data is 0, then I want to remove it. However, this one definitely still has some length, so we'd skip it over. The next iteration through, I'd look at the second entry, and it would go, aha, is there a new line? There is right here. So I want you to replace it with nothing. And it would chop down the string to start here and only include this content. And then it would look, is the length bigger than 0? Yes, it is, so leave it alone. Finally, you'll look at the last entry and replace this new line with nothing, removing this new line entirely and leaving this string empty. This is where this comes in. If my string is empty, then I want you to remove it from the list because it's no longer useful. However, I need to remember to now bump back the search through my list, because now that I've removed this entry, there's only 2 entries, and I don't want to go out of bounds, so I need to step back 1 step to take into account that I've now removed a step from the loop. And then I return the data. Let's see how this actually looks when I run it. If I take this and I split it, now we see it has a problem with it. I am now going to run, well, this here is in my reader class, and remove the lines from data, cool. So in my reader, I'm going to, let's just attach this up here. I'm going to go read, and I'll call it reader. I keep on mixing that up. And I want to remove new lines from my subword list. And I want to assign my final data to this, just for the printout here. My final data, when I print it out, take a look at it. It's nice and cleaned up. That new line is removed from it. And now I have 2 separate phrases that are each of those lines individually. Now, you might be thinking, couldn't I just have gotten these lines one at a time and stored them as a string? Definitely so. One last thing for us to look at in this section here is notice in my method, read one line from file just gets that first line. I actually don't have the ability yet to read all the lines consecutively in that file. So I need to be able to build some other logic for it. And I'll show you just here outside of a method, and you can build this in a method yourself. But one thing that I could do is I'm going to actually just open up a reader of a file, and I'm going to have this file be my test file.txt, and I'm going to read it as a reader, and I guess I need to actually do my try and my except block. Oops, I have insert there. Except IO error, print error, reading, just for now. But with this open as a reader, I want to be able to read the next line of the file. And I know in this file, this reader, I want to read line, and I want to read, oops, I can't type right now. Read line, once again, both lines. And I'm going to hold a file contents. I'm going to just set this to an empty list and have my file contents, Mr. L, append the line that I read from my reader. And then I'm going to file contents, append the other line that I read from my reader. And at the end here, I'm going to print out my file contents. Let's see what shows up at the bottom here. Here is my first text. Here is more text to add to it. So notice that even though I've gotten these lines and I've avoided this final extra empty entry, I still have the issue of these new lines being present in that strategy. So I might still have to run this on these file contents. I might still have to run this remove the new lines from data case of functionality if I wanted to get those up. Maybe it's okay to have them holding on. It just means that there'll be new lines present in your code, but it's a way of managing it to run through like a little piece of functionality like this to remove the new lines. So what I want you to take away from this is that we have the ability, when we retrieve a whole bunch of data from a file and return it, that's just one big string. We have the ability to break that string down into a bunch of individual strings for each of the words inside of it by splitting it either with a delimiter or with the built-in one, just spaces. And those new lists of words we can then use later on to be able to process information for our encryption in the way that we actually want to. So I recommend you do a bit of practicing. Try to create your own custom text file, maybe fill it with a bunch of different text in different places, read it from your file, open it up and read it, pull it in, and then see if you can't get it to be broken down into a custom list of individual words that looks really nice and clean and that you're confident you can do so.